You're gonna hold that maximal effort, or that 70% effort, for about a minute. What we could do instead is we could go into extension of our spine, which then kind of lifts the chest up nice and proud. Begin to try and rotate your shoulder this direction. So you're gonna ramp up slowly to your maximum effort over the course of time. So sometimes I might have a person grab a ball, a little bit of weight to it. I want them to hug that to their chest, and then I'll have them squeeze it. I want them to squeeze it as hard as they possibly can. I want them to drive neural drive, so I want them to emphasize as much effort and energy as they can into creating more tension. The Pales contraction is trying to rotate my palm, rotate so that my palm gets heavy against the dowel. So I'm trying to do this motion. Okay. So I like a setup that I use here next to a bench. It could be a bench, it could be a box, it could be a sofa, whatever. But I like the bench because it allows me to get my feet up underneath the area that I'm going to be using. I'm going to use a yoga block just because I don't want to dip too far down into knee flexion. So sometimes you might have a little bit of sensitivity at the knees, and maybe you need a little bit of support. Otherwise, you can come all the way down and just sit on top of the heels and get into that position. But I'm going to give myself a little bit of support here today just because I want to be comfortable. All right, so now that I've got my yoga block in place, I'm going to just take my arms, place them behind me here. Now, I'm looking for a stretch in the shoulder joint, and I already have a slight stretch, but I want to go a little bit deeper. There's a couple ways you might consider doing this. One of the ways that people typically will do is they will just kind of bend themselves forward, but that's not increasing the stretch that we want. What we could do instead is we could go into extension of our spine, which then kind of lifts the chest up nice and proud, and that should give you not only a stretch across the shoulders, but into the bicep. We're gonna hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, we're gonna begin to press down into the bench. So we're trying to do this motion here, driving down into the bench. We're gonna slowly ramp that effort up to our maximal effort over the course of about 10 seconds. We're gonna hold it for 10 to 15 seconds, and then we're gonna try and lift off. Now we should be in a position where we can't lift off, so we're engaging all this posterior shoulder stuff in order to try to lift off isometrically, driving huge neural drive there. And you're gonna hold that effort maximally for about 10 seconds and then relax. That's a Pales and Rails contraction, just giving you isometrics on both sides of the joint at end range. An alternative consideration for shoulder extension would be putting yourself in a closer position to what you would be in your dip or your row. So instead of having the arm straight out like this and going into your Pales and Rails or your isometric contractions here, what you could do is you could take a bent elbow position. Okay, so now you're in this bent elbow position, you're getting a stretch. That's gonna take the bicep out of it, and that's gonna just put it mainly on the shoulder joint itself. And you can hold this stretch for 2 minutes, and then you can also do a Pales and Rails here. So your Pales would be trying to drive the fist down using this tissue on the front side of the joint. You would ramp up to your maximal effort over the course of 10 seconds, slowly ramping, and you hold that for another 10 seconds, and then your Rails contraction would be pulling away, trying to lift those fists off the bench or whatever surface you're on. You're not gonna be able to lift off because you should be at or beyond your in range slightly. So you shouldn't be able to lift off there. And what that's going to do is allow you to contract and isometrically contract that posterior tissue during that Rails contraction. Remember, oftentimes we don't spend a lot of time at our end range. Even when we're doing exercises, we go in and out of that end range very quickly. So this gives us an opportunity to get into that end range and then provide some force into the tissue at that end range. This is going to work wonders for you and be helpful in your overall longevity and your joint health. Stretch. So what I would normally do is place a yoga block underneath the head here. And then from here, what I'm going to do is make sure my humerus is coming directly out from my shoulder. So not up at this angle, not down at this angle, but just straight out. From here, I have my elbow at 90 degrees, and I'm going to take myself into as much external rotation or internal rotation that I can control under my own power. From there, I'm going to take my top hand, and I'm going to clasp it right on the top of my wrist and hand, and I'm going to take myself just slightly past that range of motion that I have. Now we're looking for a stretch back here behind the shoulder joint. If this closed position, so a lot of people like to do it in this closed position, if this closed position is too much for the shoulder here, then I suggest leaning out of it just a little bit, because when I lean out of it a little bit, I get a little bit more room and I can target that tissue a little bit. But the emphasis is that we want to try and find that posterior capsule tissue. So that's the stretch we want. Once you feel that stretch, it doesn't need to be deep, it just needs to be a stretch. You're going to hold that stretch for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, you're going to begin to try and rotate your shoulder this direction. So you're going to ramp up slowly to your maximum effort over the course of time. Okay, so you're ramping up, you ramp up to your maximum effort, and once you've ramped up to your maximum effort, you're going to ease off of that and you're going to begin to try and rotate the opposite direction. So you're going to try to rotate away from where your hand is at and try to contract this stuff on the front side of the joint that pulls you into more internal rotation. Once again, make sure you have a yoga block or something here to support your head and neck. So for internal rotation, pails and rails from a kind of quadruped setup, we can come down into this position. So I'm on my hands and knees. I'm going to take this arm and I'm going to place it here on the floor. From there, I'm going to internally rotate as much as I can. I'm trying to find a stretch of this tissue back here. What being on the ground does is it loads that tissue and gives us a little bit of feedback into the joint. So what I can do is use my other hand and try and rotate a little bit further into more internal rotation. I'm going to hold there for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, I'm going to begin my pails contraction, which is trying to rotate into my hand, so trying to do this motion here. I'm going to resist that, so I'm ramping up to my maximum effort, and then my rails contraction is going to be trying to pull away from that into more internal rotation, so trying to go this direction towards my other leg. Now, if you are a little bit more mobile and you feel like this setup, you want to support this setup in a different way, what we can do is use our opposite leg. This is a great one for BJJ players. So I take my hand out here, I'm going to take my leg in, and then I'm going to take that knee and pull myself into internal rotation from here. And I'll hold that stretch the same way. And now when I do my pails and rails, I'm doing it up against my leg, and I have a little bit of space of support with my other arm. All right, now there's nothing wrong with using a small dumbbell to get started on your rotational training. We go through concentric work and eccentric work. It's not much of an input for someone who's a little bit stronger, but if you're in rehab or whatever, that's totally fine. But one of the things that we are often overlooking when it comes to our training of our rotational stuff is progressing it and getting stronger. And so I like to do a little bit more with my loading of my tissue, and I like to think about ways in which I can train my tissue differently and give it the kind of strength that it needs to support all of the exercises that I love doing. If I'm doing this exercise, for example, I might use a heavier load and I might do some eccentrics. So what I might do is I might get this load here, so it's a load that I can't concentrically move. So if I get here, I cannot pull this from here into external rotation. So I'm going to take myself here and I'm going to hang out here and I'm going to go slightly out of vertical. Now once I'm out of vertical, I've put tension on the posterior capsule here and I'm going to hold that. So it's a long eccentric, and over time I'm going to end up failing through that motion. I'm just going to fail quickly here. So I'm going to fail through that motion and I'm going to fight for that range of motion all the way through into the end. I might support myself at the very bottom, because at this point here, my shoulder's not used to contracting in this space here. So I might use a weight that I can control through that range of motion, or I might support myself through that final bit of the movement there. Another thing we can do is take a slightly lighter weight and work on some of the contractile properties and take this tissue to failure. So oftentimes we're just doing 3 sets of 15 or 3 sets of 20 of some really light weight. But why not challenge the tissue a little bit more with a heavier load and get my tissue to actually fail? So I might start at length here. So I'm completely at length, and I might start with some contractions here. So at the very bottom, teaching myself to move through this. And once I fail in this range here, once I can't contract here, I might move up a little bit into the next zone and contract. And then I might move up a little bit further and contract. And then I might move up a little bit further and contract. So I'm working through all of those zones, and I'm working to the point where I can no longer contract in that zone, and I move on to the next. That's just another way that you can provide a strength input to your shoulder joint. Remember that the rotational stuff of your joint is the most important stuff of your joint. It's the stuff internally that provides you the platform to do all of the things you love. So strengthen your internal stuff so that you can explore and do more with all of your external stuff. You're gonna come into abduction, so across the body, abduction and flexion. You can squeeze out as much flexion as you can, trying not to rotate through the torso. And as you move up and overhead, we're gonna go into overhead flexion. Shoulder cars are a great way to start bringing awareness to the joint tissue of the shoulder. You start out by having the arm in external rotation, standing up nice and tall. You're going to come into abduction, so across the body, abduction and flexion. You can squeeze out as much flexion as you can, trying not to rotate through the torso. And as you move up and overhead, we're going to go into overhead flexion. So now we're in overhead flexion. Our bicep is right next to our ear. We're going to imagine there's a big X on our bicep. We're going to take that X and move it away from our ear as we move into internal rotation. Careful not to hike up towards the ear here. We're moving into internal rotation. We're trying to be very isolated about how this joint moves. And then we're going to move into extension as we're moving into internal rotation here. So now we're in extension. Our back of our palm comes next to the back of our pants. We're going to extend back into as much extension as we can find, and then we're going to externally rotate. So we've externally rotated. We're going to start bringing the arm up and over into flexion again. Once we reach flexion, we're going to take our arm, we're going to begin to externally rotate into abduction as well as we come across the body and bring the arm back to where we started. Now, doing shoulder cars, as I said, is a great way to not only start moving the bone around all the available space that you have in your joint, but it's a great way to bring awareness to the tissue, awareness to your nervous system, and to help give you kind of a benchmark for where your shoulder is at any given point in time. Now, one of the things that I think I get a question about oftentimes is, well, how do I load my cars? I've got a couple of ways that I like loading the cars. Before I start to add external loads to the car, I might want to start by driving a little bit more internal force or internal drive. So sometimes I might have a person grab a ball, a little bit of weight to it. I want them to hug that to their chest, and then I'll have them squeeze it. I want them to squeeze it as hard as they possibly can. I want them to drive neural drive, so I want them to emphasize as much effort and energy as they can into creating more tension. And that's going to increase internal drive, internal force, internal neural drive. Okay, so we're not adding any external load at that point. Another way that we can start to add a little bit of internal drive is just by holding on to something. And that's a great way to start adding internal drive too, because then you can hug against the object and hold on nice and tight. What this also provides when you hold on to something stiff, like a rack, is an external block. So now the external block provides a different type of emphasis and input, because now you're taking your body up against something that's immovable. So now you have the ability to understand, am I rotating away from this post? Am I peeling away from it as I start to go into internal rotation? So now you can start to emphasize something a little bit different, and it just provides a different input, because now I can hold my abdomen and my midsection against the block, against the post, and I can move through that motion, and I might have limited range that I had before. Another thing that I can do is I can completely take my body and place it against the wall and take myself into thoracic extension or thoracic rotation. So now I'm in thoracic rotation. My spine cannot move anywhere except this direction. Okay, so now I'm running through, I lose some of my abduction, But now as I move through this portion here, I no longer have the ability to rotate through my thoracic spine in order to try and get more rotation, internal rotation of the shoulder and more extension of the shoulder. So I'm limiting the ability for this bone to be integrated into movement of the rest of my body. That doesn't mean you shouldn't integrate. What it means is we're just giving you an opportunity or placing your tissues in a variety of different circumstances that challenge the tissues differently, challenge your nervous system differently. Those are just a few ways in which you can start to change the way in which your cars have provided some form of internal drive and then a little bit of blocking in order to increase that internal drive. You can check out the full video which goes into more depth with external load on my Substack. All right, so as you may or may not know, with the golf swing, on the backswing, you require a significant amount of external rotation of the shoulder. Shoulder mobility is super important for golf. My clients all do shoulder mobility, they all do spinal mobility, and they all do hip mobility as a baseline of mobility training. But we're gonna talk about the external rotation of the shoulder. So on the backswing, you need that external rotation of your shoulder. And one of the ways that we can focus on doing that is by creating a stretch and then a strengthening response to that. I utilize pails and rails to try and expand the space there, but I utilize some other tools in order to keep and strengthen that space. So the very first thing I'm going to show you is one of the setups that I like to use with my clients in order to stimulate external rotation, stretch, and then strengthening response. So I usually get my clients seated with a dowel, and what I'll have them do is I'll take the outside of the arm and I'll place it against the dowel. I'll reach around with the hand so that I'm now locked in. So now I'm in external rotation of the shoulder. Now I can hang out here in external rotation. That's perfectly fine. I can get external rotation there. I can get external rotation through a slight degree of scaption. I can also do external rotation here, completely abducted. Either position is fine, just depends on what you're trying to stretch and where you want to be. You can do all three. That's totally fine. But I usually just pick one position and one setup for the specific session that we're working in. So from here, I'll hang out for 2 minutes, just holding that stretch, hanging out, trying to breathe into the stretch, letting this tissue kind of relax. I'm gonna pull it back into scaption. So from here, I'll just hang out, and after the 2 minutes, I'll begin my Pales contraction. The Pales contraction is trying to rotate my palm, rotate so that my palm gets heavy against the dowel. So I'm trying to do this motion. So that's internal rotation. I'm trying to do that motion, and you should feel the stuff on the front side of the shoulder trying to activate in order to do that. We're gonna ramp that up slowly over the course of time to our maximal effort. After we reach our maximal effort, we'll hold it there for a little bit, and then we'll do our rails contraction, which is trying to pull the palm away from the dowel, which is trying to rotate the humerus that direction, using this stuff on the back of the shoulder to try and squeeze out a little bit more external rotation. So that's your Pales and rails contraction. That's going to help you try and expand capsular space and get a little bit more external rotation. As I said, there's a few other tools that I use in order to help people strengthen and maintain that space, but this is the way that you want to work to expand the space of the joint and get you a little bit more external rotation there. I'm going to set up here for overhead flexion. Now, overhead flexion, we're looking for more range of motion here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Pales and rails in this position here. I'm going to take my arm, sit it on top of the box, and I'm going to get into this quadruped position. I'm going to drop my hips back, and when I drop my hips back, I'm now putting all of this tissue here on stretch. I'm going to hold that stretch for 2 minutes. This should be a position where I can't lift from. So if you can lift off from this position here, then you're not at your end range. We want to get into your end range and find that position. From there, we're going to hold for 2 minutes. After 2 minutes, what I'm going to have you first do is begin to drive downward into the box. Okay, so you're driving downward into the box. You're going to ramp up to your greatest, safest effort. And the greatest, safest effort for this initial attempt is going to be about 65 to 70% of your maximum effort. So you're going to hold that effort for about a minute. You're going to hold that maximal effort, or that 70% effort, for about a minute, and then I'm going to have you slowly change directions and reverse that, trying to lift off the box. Now, as I said before, you shouldn't be able to lift off the box because you should be either at in range or slightly beyond in range because you were in a stretch. So you're gonna contract all that stuff on the other side of the shoulder trying to lift off, and you're gonna hold that 70% effort for about a minute as well. If you like this video, be sure to smash the like button and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss a post from me again.